when the cold fluorescent lights flicker on in the execution chamber. The countdown begins. Just 15 minutes remain for a life to end, and for the state of Indiana to add another name to its judicial history. Since 1977, only 20 death row inmates have been executed in this state. The number is small, but each case has left a deep scar on the community's memory. One man murdered his ex-wife's entire family, then savored a prime rib dinner like it was a celebration. Another killed 2 children, but before dying, simply asked for a pint of ice cream. And there was one who, in his final moments, smiled defiantly and uttered words that sent chills through the room. Before we begin, leave a comment below. Which country or state are you watching from? Let's see how far these stories have traveled. Now, we begin with the first case. First, Stephen Timothy Judy. It was an April morning in 1979. A hint of spring chill still lingered in the air over Indianapolis, Indiana. Terry Chasteen, 21 years old, a single mother, was driving her Plymouth Duster, taking her 3 young children to daycare before heading to work. Misty Ann, 5 years old, sat in the front seat, twirling her golden curls. Stephen, 4, was singing in the back. The youngest, Mark, just over 2 years old, clutched his teddy bear tightly. What seemed like a normal morning suddenly turned when the car's fan belt slipped. The engine stalled in the middle of a busy highway. No cell phone. No family nearby. Terry pulled her children out of the car, hoping someone passing by might help. Then, a light blue pickup truck pulled over. A young man stepped out, tall, with wind-tossed hair. He smiled, introduced himself as Steve, and said he had experience fixing cars. His voice was soft, almost gentle. He asked, "Do you want me to give you and the kids a ride to the nearest service station?" Terry hesitated, but with no other option. She nodded. That was the moment everything fell apart. Stephen Timothy Judy, 23 years old, was no good Samaritan. He had a history of rape, had once escaped a juvenile detention center, and for years had harbored dark fantasies about hurting women. He didn't take them to a repair shop. Instead, he turned onto a narrow dirt road that led to a remote area near White Lick Creek, a place where no one would hear them scream. There, he led the mother and her children into the woods and committed a horrifying crime that left all 4 dead. The details still haunt Indiana to this day. There were no screams, no chance to run. He left their bodies scattered among the grass, stones, and cold water when the police found the children. The scene was unforgettable, a tragedy beyond imagination. Judy was arrested soon after. But what chilled Indiana wasn't just the crime, it was how he faced justice. He didn't cry. He didn't make excuses. He rejected legal counsel, refused to appeal, and in court, said coldly, "If I get out, I'll kill again." This wasn't just a trial. It was society staring into the eyes of someone who had lost all humanity. On March 9, 1981, Stephen Judy became the first person executed in Indiana since 1961. He sat in the old electric chair at the state prison in Michigan City. His last meal was like a grotesque farewell banquet: prime rib, lobster, a baked potato with sour cream, salad with French dressing, and dinner rolls. He asked for 4 cans of beer but was denied. Before the switch was flipped, Judy gave his final words: "I hold no grudges. This is something I did. I'm sorry it happened." No swearing, no blame, no plea for mercy, just a brief apology meant for someone, though no one knows who. But one thing is certain: his crime, like the waters that took those 3 children, remains etched into the death penalty history of Indiana. Second, Joseph Edward Corcoran, Fort Wayne, Indiana, July 1997. A small house sat quietly in a peaceful neighborhood, where summer nights were usually filled with the sound of crickets and the steady hum of electric fans. But that night, 4 men would never walk out of that house again. Joseph Edward Corcoran, 22 years old, walked in holding a handgun. in less than 5 minutes. 4 men lay dead: James, his own brother; Robert Turner, his sister's fiancé; and 2 close friends, Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell. They had once been family, friends, the closest people in Corcoran's life, and now they were just names on a coroner's report. There was no warning, no struggle, just an eruption, cold, brutal, and final. Corcoran opened fire, killing 4 loved ones in an instant, then walked away as if checking off a task on his daily list. The motive: no one knows for sure. Some said he was jealous. Others believed he feared betrayal. But in his medical records, doctors made one thing clear: Joseph Corcoran suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He believed his family was spying on him with ultrasonic waves, that someone was programming him to fail. When arrested, Corcoran did not resist. He was sentenced to death in 1999, but it would take nearly 25 years for Indiana to carry out that sentence, delayed by numerous appeals focused on his mental health. During that time, Corcoran lived quietly in solitary confinement, writing journals, even penning a book about being remotely controlled. On December 18th, 2024, Joseph Corcoran entered the execution chamber. He was the first person executed in Indiana after a 15-year pause. No family, no pastor, no weeping. Only medical staff and journalist witnesses to justice, or at least trying to understand it. His last meal was strikingly simple: a single pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. No meat, no dessert tray, just ice cream, cold and sweet. When asked for any final words, Corcoran simply shook his head and said, "Not really. Let's get this over with." No remorse, no denial, just a chilling surrender, like the death he once dealt to 4 of his own. Joseph Edward Corcoran, the second name on this list, leaves us with a quiet question: when someone with a broken mind commits a crime, where do we draw the line between punishment and healing? And is justice truly just for those lost long ago to madness? Third, Matthew Eric Wrinkles, Evansville, Indiana, July 1994. A quiet suburban home turned into the scene of a family massacre that shook the entire state. Matthew Eric Wrinkles, 31 years old, had once been a father, an electrician, and a man trying to survive a bitter divorce. His wife, Deborah Jean Wrinkles, had left him, taking their 2 children and staying with her brother Tony Fulkerson and sister-in-law, Natalie. A restraining order had been issued against him, but it was suddenly lifted just one day before everything fell apart. On the night of July 21st, Wrinkles, dressed in camouflage, wore a ski mask, and carried a .357 Magnum revolver along with a rifle under cover of darkness. He cut the phone line and silently broke into the house. Gunshots rang out. 3 lives were taken in minutes: Deborah, the woman he once vowed to protect; Tony, the brother-in-law; and Natalie, an innocent woman who simply opened the door. Their children were in the next room. They survived, but lost both parents in a single night. Wrinkles was arrested soon after. In his confession, he blamed emotion, drugs, and desperation, but no explanation could fully justify the cold resolve of a man who entered a home intending to end 3 lives. In 1995, he was sentenced to death. During the years that followed, Matthew became one of the few death row inmates featured in the documentary series Inside Indiana State Prison, where he spoke of regret, yet still harbored bitterness and blame. On December 11th, 2009, Matthew Eric Wrinkles entered the lethal injection chamber. His last meal had been served 3 days earlier in traditional Indiana fashion: prime rib, fried pork chops, baked potato, French fries, 2 ranch-dressed salads, and dinner rolls. When asked if he had any final words, Wrinkles replied, "Nothing at this time. Let's do it. Lock and load." That's a borrowed line, but whatever. A sentence that felt like both defiance and surrender. Matthew Eric Wrinkles, the man who killed 3 family members in one night, a father who lost everything, became the last person executed in Indiana before the state paused capital punishment. And his story, like an interrupted song, still echoes in the minds of the children left behind. Fourth, Alan Lehman Matheny, Mishawaka, Indiana. A cool afternoon in early March 1989. Lisa Bianco, 29 years old, had just returned home from a walk with her 2 young daughters. Their small house sat in a quiet neighborhood, where the only sounds most afternoons were the patter of children's footsteps. But just minutes later, the air was filled with screams and an ending no one could reverse. Alan Lehman, Matheny Lisa's ex-husband, had been serving time for assaulting and confining her. He had been granted an 8-hour release from prison for a home visit. But instead of returning to Indianapolis as planned, he drove straight to South Bend. He stopped by a friend's house to pick up a shotgun, then headed for Lisa's home. When Lisa saw him crossing the yard, weapon in hand, eyes red with rage, she knew she had to run. She bolted out the door, shouting for help. Neighbors peeked through windows. Her daughters watched, frozen in terror, but no one reached her in time. Right there in the street, in full view of her children, Lisa was beaten to death by Alan. This wasn't just a murder. It was a betrayal of a system that had promised to protect her. Alan was arrested shortly afterward, in the early days of his detention. He claimed hallucinations said Lisa was part of a conspiracy against him. He insisted he remembered nothing, but forensic experts concluded he was fully aware of his actions. In 1990, the court sentenced him to death. The case sparked a wave of reform in Indiana's prison system, including new laws requiring that victims be notified any time an inmate is released, even temporarily. On September 28, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison, Alan Lehman Matheny entered the execution chamber. His final meal was simple, almost like a quiet family dinner: fried chicken wings, French fries, boiled corn, biscuits, and a chocolate milkshake. Before the injection, Alan gave his final words: "I love my family and my children. I am sorry for the pain I have caused them. I thank the friends who stood by me. I am certain my grandchildren will grow up strong and happy in the care of their wonderful parents." But no apology, however heartfelt or late, could erase the pain that Lisa Bianco and her children endured. Alan Matheny, once a father, once a husband, became a symbol of how the system failed to protect a victim of domestic violence, and his sentence became an unspoken warning that sometimes institutional neglect can be a death sentence of its own. Fifth, Donald Ray Wallace Jr. Evansville, Indiana, January 1980. The city lay under the chill of early winter, when a brutal family massacre, the worst in local history, shattered the calm of a quiet neighborhood. Donald Ray Wallace Jr., 23 years old, started that night with the intent to steal. He broke into Ralph Hendrick's home, but, as he later admitted, got greedy and targeted the house next door where the Gilligan family lived. He didn't expect them to be home. Patrick Gilligan, his wife Teresa, and their 2 young children, Lisa, 5 years old, and Gregory, 4, were in the middle of dinner. Wallace entered with a gun, took control, and, in a calculated act of cruelty, murdered all 4. Later, Wallace confessed to friends he shot Patrick for causing trouble, shot Teresa because she screamed and he needed her to be quiet. "As for the children," he said, "I couldn't let them grow up with the pain of losing their parents." He left the house with a gun, a CB radio, a scanner, and other items, all of which were later traced back to him. The community was horrified. Police tracked him down within days. Wallace was arrested but denied the killings. For the next 2 years, he claimed insanity and was held in a psychiatric hospital. His IQ was measured at 130, but just weeks before his execution, Wallace admitted he had faked it. The case of Donald Wallace did more than shock the public. It came to represent absolute cold-bloodedness, a sharp mind, fully aware, completely calculated, and without a trace of remorse. On March 10, 2005, Wallace entered the lethal injection chamber at the Indiana State Prison. His final meal, a sirloin steak, baked potato, soup, and chocolate truffle cake from a local Damon's Grill, was served as a quiet ritual before the end. When asked for final words, Wallace said, "I hope everyone can find peace after this. No grand statements, no resistance, but also no real remorse." Donald Ray Wallace Jr., a thief who stepped into the wrong house and became a killer. He wasn't overtaken by rage or delusion. He simply chose and delivered death. His story is a grim reminder that some crimes can't be explained by anger or illness, only by cruelty. Sixth, Bill J. Benefiel Terre Haute, Indiana, October 1986, in a quiet neighborhood where lawns were neatly trimmed and cars lined up in driveways. No one knew that just a few houses away, a living nightmare was unfolding behind aging walls. Bill J. Benefiel, 27 years old at the time, was a reclusive man, barely noticed. But inside an abandoned house he had renovated, he built his own world, a world of control, violence, and unspeakable cruelty. A 17-year-old girl named Alicia Elmore was held captive in that house for 4 months. What she endured during that time, though impossible to fully recount, was enough to horrify an entire community once the truth came out. He controlled every minute, limited her food and movement, and blindfolded her to keep her from identifying him. In January 1987, Alicia discovered she wasn't the only one. 18-year-old Dolores Wells was also being held. Soon after, Dolores disappeared. Her body was later found buried nearby. That was when Alicia saw her chance and escaped. Police raided the house and arrested Bill Benefiel. He did not resist. In court, he tried to claim insanity, but doctors determined he was fully competent. His actions were not the result of illness, they were deliberate choices. In 1988, he was sentenced to death on April 21, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison. Benefiel faced his final sentence. His last meal was bizarre, almost like a twisted celebration: a large pizza topped with sausage, pepperoni, mushrooms, onions, green peppers, black olives, and tomatoes, a 12-inch Italian beef sub with cheese, 4 quarts of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, butter pecan, Cherry Garcia, New York super fudge chunk, and oatmeal cookie chunk, a Dutch apple pie, 6 cans of RC Cola, and 6 cans of Pepsi. Before the injection, Benefiel looked directly at the executioner and said, "No. Just get it over with. Let's do it. No apology, no remorse." Bill Benefiel, the man who created a real-life hell inside a suburban home, left this world in silence. But his story lives on. A deep crack in the heart of Terre Haute, and a chilling reminder that behind any door, darkness might be waiting. 7th, Gregory Scott Johnson. Anderson, Indiana, June 1985. The sun had not yet fully risen when thick black smoke began pouring from the roof of a small, peaceful home. By the time firefighters arrived, there was only one thing left to pull from the ashes: the body of 82-year-old Ruby Hutzlar. She had lived alone, known by neighbors as kind and quiet. But her death wasn't an accident. All around the house were signs of a break-in: cabinets flung open, belongings scattered, footprints marked the floor, and walls the first clues that led police to Gregory Scott Johnson, 20 years old. At first, he denied everything. But the evidence was overwhelming: the footprints, witness accounts, physical traces. Gregory confessed he had broken in to steal, but when Ruby confronted him, he panicked, killed her, then set the house on fire to cover it all up. The community was stunned. A defenseless elderly woman, murdered in her own home. In 1986, the court sentenced him to death, but Johnson would spend nearly 2 more decades behind bars, filing appeal after appeal, not out of innocence, but to delay the inevitable. In 2005, Johnson requested a stay of execution for humanitarian reasons. He wanted to donate part of his liver to his ailing sister. The request divided public opinion. Some sympathized. Others believed forgiveness should not come so easily. The request was denied. On May 25, 2005, Gregory Scott Johnson entered the execution chamber at the Indiana State Prison. His final meal: barbecued ribs, pulled pork, sautéed mushrooms, soda, and chocolate cheesecake, though his specific request for an Oreo version was unavailable for his attorneys. He ordered pizzas, perhaps a late thank you, or a hollow gesture in the face of the end. Johnson's final words were brief and quiet. "You've been very professional. No excuses, no pleas. Just a closing line like the last door shutting behind a man who once had a choice and chose the wrong one." Gregory Johnson, a name now tied to a fire that destroyed more than a house. It burned through trust, through peace, through an entire neighborhood's sense of safety. A quiet end to a path of irreversible wrongdoing. 8. Kevin Aaron Connor. Indianapolis, Indiana, January 1988. The chill of the new year left the streets quieter than usual, but in a small home on the city's west side. Laughter and the smell of alcohol still drifted through the windows. 4 men had gathered: Kevin Connor, Tony Moore, Steve Wentland, and Bruce Voge. That night, none of them knew only one would still be alive by dawn. After hours of drinking, Moore, Connor, and Wentland left the house in a car. The mood was sluggish until an argument broke out between Moore and Wentland in the vehicle. Moore assaulted Wentland. When the victim tried to flee, Moore chased him down with the car, running him over. Connor, instead of stopping the violence, joined in. Wentland died in the dark. But that was only the beginning. Soon after, Connor and Moore returned to their workplace. A new argument sparked, this time about the murder. Connor pulled out a gun and shot Moore on the spot. Then, he returned to the original house, where Bruce Voge, the 4th man, was still asleep on the couch. Connor raised the gun again, taking a 3rd life in one night. He was arrested in Texas days later. Connor didn't deny the killings. He accepted the death sentence without resistance. Years later, he voluntarily waived all appeals, as if he himself knew the line had been crossed beyond return. On July 27, 2005, Kevin Connor spent his final hours in the death row wing at the Indiana State Prison. That evening, he was granted a rare exception permission to smoke 2 cigars, a privilege rarely extended to inmates awaiting execution. His last meal included 4 chili dogs, onion rings, a banana cream pie, and an Oreo cookie blizzard ice cream. When asked if he had any final words, Kevin Connor offered a faint smile and said, "Everyone's got to die sometime, so keep on killing. No remorse, no request for mercy. Just a cold, haunting sentence left hanging in the room." Kevin Connor, who took 3 lives in just a few hours, stood as a grim example of how anger and alcohol can open the door to destruction. And sometimes, the silence of a conscience is more chilling than any sentence a court could deliver. 9th, Joseph L. Trueblood, Lafayette, Indiana, August 1988. Early in the morning, Joseph Trueblood, 31 years old, drove to pick up his former girlfriend, Susan Boucher, 22, along with her 2 young children, Ashlyn, 2.5, and William, just 17 months old. No one knew this would be the last ride they would ever take. Joseph and Susan had a long history of breakups. She had recently chosen to leave him for her former husband, a decision Joseph refused to accept. Friends sensed tension, but no one could have imagined the heartbreak that would follow. According to court records, Joseph killed all 3 at close range. The murders stunned the state. Later, he drove to his brother's home, borrowed a shovel, dug a shallow grave near the outskirts of West Point, and buried their bodies. Trueblood was arrested shortly after. At his first trial, he admitted to killing Susan, hoping it might spare him the death penalty. But later, he changed his story, claiming Susan had killed the children and then herself, and that he only helped with the final shot. His shifting narrative, combined with his brother's testimony and forensic evidence, proved otherwise. The court was not convinced. Joseph was sentenced to death for all 3 murders. His appeals stretched over a decade and failed. On the night of June 13, 2003, at the Indiana State Prison, Joseph Trueblood entered his final hours. He refused a special last meal as a protest against what he called a ritual of state-sponsored killing. Instead, he was served the standard prison fare, a bologna sandwich, a cheese sandwich, fruit, and cookies. He did not eat. His final statement, read aloud by attorney John Summers, declared, "I am innocent. Bosher committed suicide. I only pled guilty because my lawyer told me it was the only way to avoid the death penalty. That is the only reason I admitted guilt. If I took a polygraph, it would prove I'm telling the truth." Joseph L. Trueblood, once a trusted companion to a young mother and her children, left the world in controversy, denial, and silence. But the question lingers still: was he a victim or the true perpetrator? And if justice remains unsure, can truth ever fully come to light? 10. Kevin Lee Ho, Fort Wayne, Indiana, November 1985. In a small house on West Wayne Street, two longtime friends, Theodore Bosler, 49, and Martin Rubrake, 56, lived quiet, simple lives. They shared rent, shared meals, and shared the everyday rhythm of aging together. But one fateful evening, that house became the site of a crime that shook the entire community. Kevin Lee Ho, 26 years old, had once been an acquaintance. He and his younger brother, Dwayne Lapp, showed up at the door claiming they needed to settle a financial issue. Rubrake let them in without hesitation. Just minutes later, Ho led both men into the basement, in the dim light. He pulled a gun. When Rubrake resisted with a remote control, Ho shot him in the chest. Bosler, who had been lying on the floor as ordered, was also shot without mercy. Then, Ho returned and fired again just to make sure he was dead. Before leaving, he searched the bodies and stole their rings, and in a final act of cruelty, he stomped on Rubrake's face. Just 11 days earlier, Ho had committed another murder, and Tony Bartkowiak, a Polish immigrant. Ho and his accomplice interrogated him about drugs, then executed him when they found nothing. 3 lives, 11 days, a cold, calculated trail of violence. Ho was arrested and sentenced to death in 1987. Over the next 17 years, he filed numerous appeals but never fully denied what he had done. Some things the law cannot erase. On May 2nd, 2003, at the Indiana State Prison, Kevin Ho entered the execution chamber. He declined a special last meal not as a gesture of remorse, but perhaps simply to end it all in silence. Just before the injection, Ho gave his final words: "I hope the victims' families find some measure of satisfaction. I hope their sorrow is not too great." A gentle statement, but not enough to soothe what had been taken. Kevin Lee Ho, who killed 3 people for greed and disregard, left this world quietly. But what he left behind still echoes in the memory of a community that once believed evil couldn't come knocking in the middle of everyday life. 11. Benjamin Donnie Ritchie. In late September of 2000, the quiet suburb of Beech Grove, just outside Indianapolis, echoed with the sound of police sirens. Officer William Bill Toney, 31 years old and a new father, was dispatched to stop a stolen pickup truck. Behind the wheel was Benjamin Donnie Ritchie, just 20 years old, with a juvenile record and under supervision for theft. As Officer Toney leaned in to check the license plate, Ritchie pulled out a gun and fired 4 times. One shot pierced the officer's vest, ending his life right there on the roadside. No time to call for help. No one close enough to stop it. His death sent shockwaves through the Beech Grove community. He was the first officer ever to fall in the line of duty there. Ritchie was arrested shortly after and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors described it as a cold-blooded execution of a public servant. The courtroom and the public were torn when medical records revealed Ritchie had been born with brain damage caused by alcohol exposure, diagnosed with FASD, bipolar disorder, and lead poisoning from childhood. Could someone like that be fully responsible for his actions? The trial dragged on for nearly 25 years, on May 20th, 2025. After a 15-year pause in executions, Indiana carried out its final death sentence for Richie at the Michigan City prison. His last meal was Olive Garden's Tour of Italy combo, fettuccine alfredo, lasagna, and chicken parmesan. Right before the injection, Richie said, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I have gotten. I hope they all find peace." Outside, Officer Tony's widow stood silently, the final voice for a husband who could no longer speak. She told reporters, "It's time to close this chapter of my life." Their daughter, once just a newborn, grew up without a father, a loss no words could ever truly heal. To Richie's legal team, he was a man with severe, lifelong conditions beyond his control. But to the Tony family, the law wasn't a magic wand that could fix the damage. It was a tool to carry out judgment when a late apology could no longer mend what was broken. They waited nearly 25 years to see the final reckoning for the man who took away a husband, a father, not to bring something back, but to finally let go. 12th, David Leon Woods. In 1984, in Garrett, a quiet suburb near Fort Wayne, Indiana, 77-year-old Juan Plasencia lived alone in a modest wooden home. One night in April, just after he turned off the lights to rest, 3 young men broke through his door. Among them was 19-year-old David Leon Woods, the one who led the plan to steal. Their targets were simple: an old TV and about $130 in cash. But this wasn't just a petty theft. During the struggle, Mr. Plasencia was injured and collapsed into his living room chair. The space was left in chaos. Furniture overturned, belongings scattered. After grabbing a few items, the intruders disappeared into the night. Police arrived to a disturbing scene and footprints left behind. It was terrifying, one investigator recalled, saying the scene was beyond what most people could bear, and calling it one of the most distressing cases of his entire career. Neighbors were shocked and heartbroken. Juan was known as a kind, soft-spoken man who lived alone and often chatted with those nearby. No one imagined that his quiet home, where he watered the plants each morning, would become the place where his life ended, alone in chaos he never caused. Woods and his 2 accomplices were quickly identified and arrested, thanks to a tip from someone close to the victim. The knife used in the attack was found discarded in a creek nearby. What shocked investigators most was Woods's demeanor. Cold and expressionless. A robbery had become something far more chilling in a town that had never known such fear. David Leon Woods was sentenced to death in 1985. For the next 22 years, the victim's family followed every appeal, waiting for justice to be carried out. On May 4, 2007, the execution took place at Michigan City Prison. For his final meal, Woods requested pizza and birthday cake, which he quietly shared with family in an unusual farewell. His last words were gentle, but never enough to erase the pain. "I want Mr. Juan's family to know that I am truly sorry for what I did." The Plasencia family did not attend the execution, but according to a neighbor, they had waited nearly a quarter century for what they believed was a fair ending. Though David Leon Woods ultimately paid the price, his death could never fill the space Mr. Juan left behind. An elderly man lost to a senseless break-in, and in this story, no words could ever fully ease the loss that his family would carry forever. 13th, Michael Allen Lambert. In late 1990, 26-year-old Michael Allen Lambert was found drunk and taken into custody by police in Muncie, Indiana. But instead of being brought safely to the station, Lambert, still intoxicated and carrying a gun stolen from his workplace, turned around and shot Officer Greg Winters in the back, even while his hands were cuffed. Winters, the father of 2 young children, passed away days later due to severe injuries from the shooting. Prosecutors said Lambert fired 4 or 5 times, calling it a deliberate act of violence against an officer performing his duty. The Winters family was devastated. The Muncie community was stunned. An officer who was simply doing his job was taken in the very patrol car meant to protect him. In a 1992 trial, the jury agreed that the crime warranted the death penalty. In the years that followed, Lambert filed multiple appeals, arguing that he was too intoxicated to understand his actions when placed in the police car. But both Indiana courts and federal judges rejected the claim. On June 15, 2005, Lambert was executed at Michigan City Prison, the first execution following the death of another inmate just months earlier. He was offered a last meal but chose not to eat. He also declined to speak, a silence that stood out in the execution chamber. Surprisingly, this death row inmate had another side. He was once gifted a 3-month-old kitten, which he saved for his son, a small gesture that revealed a different part of a man otherwise defined by judgment. The execution took place just after 12:01 in the morning. A staff member announced, "Michael Lambert is deceased," in a room filled with silence, broken only by the quiet murmurs of the victim's family watching behind the glass. The Winters family chose not to make a statement. They had waited 15 years for this legal moment to close a painful chapter. But for many in the community, Lambert's death left behind a question. Does capital punishment truly stop evil, or is it just a final sentence that can never heal the wounds? 14th, Gerald Bivens. In January of 1991, Gerald Bivens, recently released on parole, joined 2 accomplices in a violent robbery that ended with the death of Pastor William Radcliffe. The attack happened at a rest stop off Interstate 65, just north of Indianapolis. Bivens later claimed that Radcliffe recognized him mid-theft, causing him to panic and take the life of a man who had once helped him through a recovery program. This wasn't just a shocking crime because the victim was a pastor. It also exposed how deeply parole could be abused. The courtroom was tense during the trial. The victim's family sat silently as a representative testified that Radcliffe was a kind man who had made it his mission to help people rebuild their lives, including Bivens. The system had given Bivens a second chance. He returned it with a crime no amount of time or law could erase. The room fell still when someone described Bivens' actions as a betrayal of justice that cannot be softened, reflecting the deep anger and pain felt by the community. On March 14, 2001, Indiana carried out its final judgment on Bivens at Michigan City Prison. He became the 8th person executed since the state reinstated the death penalty in 1981. For the first time, he was allowed to eat a meal prepared by his mother in the prison kitchen, a closely supervised final meal of German ravioli and chicken dumplings. Just before the execution, Bivens said, "I wish to apologize to the victim's family for the pain I have caused them, and for the pain I have caused my family and friends, and I ask that they be forgiven, and I ask that those that do this to me be forgiven." The Radcliffe family made no public comment. Those who attended the execution described a heavy silence. No crying, just the sense that the system had carried out its duty, but without offering true comfort to the ones left behind. 2 days later, Bivens' mother, who had stood beside him in the prison kitchen, attempted to take her own life in a nearby hotel. She later said the pain of losing her son was too much to bear. It was a haunting reminder that a crime doesn't only destroy one family, it casts a shadow on another. Gerald Bivens wasn't just another name on death row, he was a reflection of a parole system that failed to save him. A man once given a chance, who chose to betray that trust in the most brutal way. 15th, Marvin Beegler. In December of 1981, Marvin Beegler, a drug dealer in Howard County, Indiana, suspected that Tommy Miller was leaking information to the police. Acting on nothing more than suspicion, Beegler and a friend broke into Miller's trailer in Russiaville. They shot and killed Tommy, who was just 20 years old, and his wife, Kimberly Jane Miller, 19 and pregnant. It wasn't just an act of revenge. It shattered a young family based on a baseless fear. Beegler was sentenced to death and spent decades on Indiana's death row. He filed numerous appeals and challenged the legality of lethal injection. But both the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court rejected all attempts to delay the sentence. Members of the Miller family, including Kimberly's parents and younger brother, repeatedly urged the courts to uphold the death penalty. The entire family has lived with this pain for over 2 decades. a representative stated during the clemency hearing. There was no miracle for Beegler. On the night of January 26, 2006, about 8 hours before his execution, he asked to be baptized into the Catholic Church and received final rites from Father Thomas McNally, a spiritual turning point in his final hours. On January 27, 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the last stay issued by a lower court, clearing the way for Indiana to move forward. Beegler was executed by lethal injection at around 1:17 in the morning. He became the 87th person executed in Indiana since 1900, and the 17th since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1977. His last meal was elaborate: shrimp, mushrooms, onion rings as an appetizer, New York strip steak, chicken breast, a baked potato, salad, and a can of 7-Up. A grand meal, as if preparing for the final judgment of justice. When asked if he had any last words, Beegler replied, his voice rough, "Let's get it over with. No remorse, no apology, a cold farewell from a man sentenced to die, and from a justice system that had reached its conclusion." Soon after, a police officer from Howard County remarked, "This case is a tragic example of what baseless suspicion and hate can lead to." Even after more than 24 years, many still remember the lives of Tommy and Kimberly Miller were never returned. 16. William Clyde Gibson III. On a morning in April of 2012, the city of New Albany, Indiana, was shaken by the discovery of 75-year-old Christine Whitus, found lifeless in the garage of her own home. She had been a close friend of William Clyde Gibson III's mother, who had passed away not long before. Still mourning the loss of her friend, Christine had gone to Gibson's house to offer comfort. But that visit would be her last. At first, authorities believed it was an isolated case, but as they searched the property, a second body was found. 35-year-old Stephanie Kirk, who had been reported missing weeks earlier, buried in Gibson's backyard. Then, DNA evidence linked him to an unsolved murder in Florida, dating back to 2002. The victim was Karen Hodella. 3 victims, 3 stories, 3 lives ended quietly. All had one thing in common: they trusted, or at least never feared, William Clyde Gibson. When arrested, Gibson confessed that the known victims were not even 1/10 of what he had done. That chilling claim stunned investigators. Medical and psychological reports revealed that he had prior convictions for assault, had undergone psychiatric treatment, and was long considered a high-risk individual for violent behavior. Police described the backyard search as unearthing layers of hell, each patch of dirt turned over, each trace examined. And with every new piece of evidence, the horror grew deeper. They weren't just finding remains. They were uncovering the buried questions of a violent past that should have been stopped long ago. On November 26, 2013, Gibson received his first death sentence for the killing of Christine Whitus. On April 15, 2014, another death sentence was added for the murder of Stephanie Kirk. Though he appealed, every request was denied. The court ruled that the brutality, his criminal record, and his attitude showed no room for mercy. While imprisoned at Michigan City, Gibson rarely spoke to the media. But he did appear in the documentary Inside Death Row and on the True Crime podcast Where the Bodies Are Buried, where he hinted again that there were more victims than the official count. To this day, William Clyde Gibson III remains on death row. But for many in Indiana, what they await isn't just justice, it's the names of those still missing, the victims never found, the souls never called by name. Jeffrey Allen Weishaupt. On the night of April 10, 2010, in Evansville, Indiana, Jeffrey Weishaupt was watching over his girlfriend's 2 children, 8-year-old Alyssa and 5-year-old Caleb, in a small wooden home off Fisher Road. But soon, neighbors saw heavy smoke and flames rising from the house. The fire began in the children's bedroom and spread fast long before help could arrive. When police and firefighters extinguished the flames, they found Caleb tied to a mattress, gagged. Alyssa was motionless inside a closet. Both children had lost their lives from smoke inhalation. Investigators described the scene as utterly heartbreaking, overwhelmed by horror. Meanwhile, Weishaupt had fled. He left the burning house behind. A few hours later, federal agents captured him in Kentucky after a high-speed chase. He resisted arrest, attempted to harm himself, and declared he wanted to die because he was tired of living. At trial in June of 2013, Weishaupt was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and arson resulting in serious harm. His defense team cited schizophrenia and uncontrollable bipolar disorder. But the court heard about 2 innocent children, taken in a blaze that was, as the prosecution argued, an act of extreme violence meant to hide another crime. The courtroom was visibly moved. The family of Lisa Lynch, mother of Alyssa and Caleb, submitted a tearful letter describing their children as joyful, loving, and full of life. They asked that the death penalty be enforced, so no one can ever repeat a crime like this. The Clark County judge agreed with the jury's recommendation, stating the act was not just brutal, but a deliberate destruction of the most innocent lives. By late 2018, both the Indiana Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court rejected Weishaupt's appeals, confirming that the trial process and death sentence were legal and appropriate. Jeffrey Weishaupt remains on death row, and with each passing day, the people of Evansville are reminded of one truth. The death penalty may not be the only answer, but it is sometimes the final period in a story far too cruel to continue. Kevin Charles Isom. On the evening of August 6, 2007, gunfire erupted at the Lakeshore Dunes apartment complex in Gary, Indiana. Residents panicked and called the police. When the SWAT team reached the apartment of Kevin Charles Isom, they were met with a horrifying scene of a family tragedy. In the living room, the body of 40-year-old Cassandra Isom, Kevin's wife, was found lifeless. Inside the bedroom were 2 children, 13-year-old Andrea Cole and 16-year-old Michael Moore, Cassandra's children from a previous relationship, both brutally killed. When officers entered, Isom was lying unconscious in a pool of blood next to a .357 Magnum revolver. Police also recovered 2 other weapons, a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a 12-gauge shotgun, both used in the killings. At the station, Isom offered no resistance. In his first statement, he said, "I can't believe I killed my family. This can't be real." But the evidence made it clear. This was not a sudden break. It was a calculated act. Witnesses revealed a history of domestic violence and reported heated arguments within the family just days before. Isom's trial began in November of 2012, after a previous attempt was canceled due to an incomplete jury. In February of 2013, the jury found him guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Given the severity of the case, 3 victims, all family members, Isom was sentenced to 3 consecutive death penalties. He appealed multiple times, citing issues with jury selection and mental health concerns. But both the Indiana Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court upheld the sentences. To this day, Kevin Charles Isom remains on death row at Michigan City. No execution date has been set. The local community has not forgotten that night. Children who once played with Andrea and Michael are now grown. But the memory of flashing lights, sirens, and cries from grieving relatives still lingers. Kevin Isom's case was more than just the destruction of a family. It was a wake-up call about the consequences of unchecked domestic violence. Justice may have been served, but the loss of Cassandra and her children left behind wounds that will never fully heal in the heart of Gary. Eric Darnell Holmes. On the night of November 16, 1989, the Shoney's restaurant in Marion County, Indiana, was getting ready to close. Manager Charles Irvin, 30 years old, was checking the cash register. Teresa Blosel, a young employee just 20, was cleaning up after her shift. The night air was calm. The smell of fried oil still lingered in the kitchen, but neither of them would make it home. Hidden in a dark corner behind the counter, Eric Darnell Holmes, a former employee who had been fired, was waiting. He didn't come to apologize, he didn't come to talk. Along with an accomplice, he walked in carrying a knife, heading straight toward the foyer where Charles and Teresa had just stepped out. Their screams were smothered behind the walls. Charles was stabbed and collapsed. Teresa tried to fight back, but couldn't escape a fatal blow. One more employee was attacked, but survived. That person became the only witness, sharing the story in court with a trembling voice and haunted eyes. During the assault, Holmes spoke chilling words, almost like a ritual. "Murder in the first degree. This is the real truth. We will triumph." Investigators described the killing as an execution. The Marion County community was in shock. Shoney's, once a warm family dinner spot, was now surrounded by yellow tape and flashing lights. People gathered to light candles. Teresa's mother, Jean Blosel, couldn't believe it when she heard her daughter had died at the place where she last called home, saying, "Just one more hour and my shift's over." Holmes was captured in less than 48 hours. At his 1992 trial, he didn't deny his role. He also showed no remorse. Prosecutors called it a cold and senseless tragedy. The jury took only a few hours to deliver their decision: the death penalty. On March 26, 1993, the sentence was officially handed down. Holmes became one of the youngest inmates on Indiana's death row. Since then, he has filed numerous appeals, citing childhood trauma, mental health issues, and problems with jury selection. But both the Indiana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld his sentence. Holmes remains on death row in Michigan City. More than 35 years after the crime, there is still no scheduled execution. During one court review, an aging investigator recalled, "I'll never forget the look in Teresa's eyes when we carried her out. She was still wearing her apron, still holding her little purse." Eric Holmes may have gone silent for over 3 decades, but for the Blosel and Irvin families, and for those who worked at Shoney's that night, the memories never fade. One shattering moment, and a justice process still echoing through the decades. Roy Lee Ward. On the early morning of July 11, 2001, the rural town of Dale, in Spencer County, Indiana, was just waking under soft sunlight. In a small home on a quiet street, 15-year-old Stacy Payne was getting ready for school like she did every morning. She changed into her uniform, ate breakfast, and packed her books, unaware that in just a few minutes, her home would become the site of a tragedy the town would never forget. As Stacy stepped into the kitchen, a stranger suddenly appeared at the back door. He walked in without knocking, without a word of warning, and introduced himself as Roy Lee Ward. He claimed he was looking for his lost dog. Stacy was confused, barely able to react when Ward overpowered her with force. Her voice cried out, "Please stop," just loud enough to wake her younger sister Melissa, who was asleep upstairs. Melissa rushed down the stairs in a panic and saw her sister pinned to the kitchen floor, her face pale with fear. Without thinking, she grabbed the phone and dialed 911, trying to explain what she had seen between sobs. Police arrived within minutes. When they forced their way into the house, they found Stacy lying motionless on the cold tile. She had suffered severe injuries to her neck and abdomen, wounds so devastating that an emergency doctor later confirmed there was no chance of survival from the very beginning. Roy Lee Ward was apprehended at the scene. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. Officers handcuffed him and led him outside. One officer recalled, "He didn't fight. He just stood there, looking around like he was the one who had been wrongly arrested." That moment, a man standing calm after an unspeakable act, a young girl lifeless on the kitchen floor, and her sister trembling with the phone in hand, stayed with everyone who was there. And from that moment on, Dale would never feel like an innocent town again. The first trial in 2002 was canceled due to overwhelming media coverage. In the second trial, held in 2007, Ward was convicted of rape and first-degree murder. The jury found 3 aggravating factors: sexual assault, murder committed inside the victim's home, and a clear intent to kill, and sentenced him to death. Since then, Ward has filed numerous appeals, challenging jury selection, citing mental illness, and accusing the media of bias. But both the Indiana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the ruling. firmly stating that the death sentence was appropriate. In 2019, he again claimed the death penalty was unconstitutional, and again, the court denied his plea. Today, Roy Lee Ward remains on death row at Michigan City. No execution date has been set. In Dale, a town that once felt safe, the memory of Stacy, the girl in her bright white school uniform, still lingers. And while justice may have been served, the question remains: can a death sentence ever restore trust to a grieving town or bring healing to the family of a 15-year-old girl? Each story you've heard is more than a case file. It is a tragedy with echoes that never fade. A child without a mother, a husband left without a wife, parents holding a photograph they'll never update. Among the inmates on this list, some have died, others remain, but all have left behind holes that no sentence could ever fill. Justice may arrive late. It may never feel complete. But the truth deserves to be told. Not to stir anger, but to remind us that every stolen life deserves to be remembered. By name, by face, by a story that will not be forgotten. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, for justice, for empathy, and for those who cannot speak, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. What does justice mean to a family that has lost everything? Leave your answer, because sometimes justice isn't in the verdict. It's in the fact that we still remember who they were.